At the party celebrating the $32 million sale of my company, my daughter-in-law, Wendy, slipped white powder into my wine, all because I refused to give them $5 million. My own son stood there, silent. They thought I was just an old man, an easy target, but they had no idea. The lesson I was about to teach them would be far more costly than any amount of money. Have you ever looked back on the long road of your life and felt, deep in your bones, that it was all worth it? Hello, my friends. My name is Daniel Davis. Thanks for being here. Whether you're listening from your garage, the cab of your truck, or just some quiet corner you've carved out for yourself, let me know you're here with a like and a comment about where you're from. Tonight, I want to tell you about my retirement party. The night I thought was the summit of my life, but turned out to be the edge of a cliff. My house had a special kind of hum to it that evening. This wasn't one of those fancy catered parties you see in the movies. This was an American gathering, the kind where friendships are measured in firm handshakes and stories you've heard 100 times but laugh at anyway. The smell of slow-smoked ribs from my brand-new Traeger grill drifted across the backyard, mixing with the clean scent of freshly cut grass. Coolers were packed to the brim with ice-cold Miller Lite, and on a dedicated table, a few bottles of Maker's Mark wine I'd been saving for this exact occasion stood like proud soldiers. I made my way through the crowd, a sea of familiar faces. These were the men who'd stood by me for 40 years, through thick and thin. Men who'd been there when my first prototype failed and there when we landed our first big contract. Seeing them all here, in my yard, under the string lights my wife had insisted on, it made everything real. It finally hit me that the $32 million from the sale of the company were just numbers on a piece of paper. My real legacy, the thing I was truly proud of, was the respect I saw in their eyes. It was in the solid clap on the back from my old foreman, the knowing nod from my first investor. That's something money can't buy, and it was the only thing I ever truly wanted. But then, in the middle of all that warmth, I saw them. My son, Dennis, and his wife, Wendy. They were standing off to one side, near the old oak tree, completely separate from the celebration. They weren't talking to anyone, weren't laughing. They were in their own little world, a dark island in a sea of joy. I watched as Wendy leaned in close to Dennis, her long, slender hand gesturing first toward me, then toward the house. Dennis just nodded, his face heavy with a look I couldn't quite place, but it felt familiar. It felt wrong. I know that look. I'd seen it hundreds of times across a boardroom table. It wasn't the proud gaze of a son watching his father on his big day. It was the look of a man weighing his options, calculating his next move, preparing for a negotiation. The warmth that had filled my chest just moments before began to cool, like a sudden draft from a window left open on a cold night, even though it was a humid summer evening. It wasn't long before Dennis made his way over, Wendy trailing behind him like a shadow. "Dad, we need to talk for a minute, in private," he said, his voice low, just for me to hear. They didn't lead me to a quiet corner of the yard. They walked me right past my friends, past the laughter, and into my home office, the one room I considered my sanctuary, where the original blueprints for my first design still hung on the wall. Dennis closed the door behind us, shutting out the sounds of the party. There was no hug, no congratulations. He got straight to it. "Dad, $5 million. We need it now." The words just hung there in the air, cold and hard. It felt like someone had just taken a sledgehammer to the crystal trophy of my life's work. My entire career, all the sacrifices, all the pride I felt just moments ago, it was all being reduced to a transaction. My honor, my legacy, it meant nothing. It was just a number. I shook my head, not because of the money. I've given my son more than that over the years. I shook my head because of the wound they'd just torn open inside me. "This isn't the time or the place for this, Dennis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That's when Wendy stepped forward. Her usually sweet smile was gone, replaced by something hard and unfamiliar. "Well, if you don't want to treat us like family, Dad, then I guess you can't expect any more holiday visits. No more phone calls just to check in." She said it so casually, so softly, but every word was a razor blade. They weren't just asking for money. They were turning the very idea of family, the one thing I held sacred, into a bargaining chip. They were putting a price tag on their love. We walked back out to the party. Wendy immediately took Dennis's arm, and just like that, the smile was back on her face, as if nothing had happened. She greeted my friends, graciously accepting their congratulations on my behalf. But for me, everything had changed. The joyful facade had been shattered. Now, every laugh sounded hollow, every toast felt like a lie. I looked at my son, the boy I taught how to tie his shoes and throw a baseball, and I saw him standing silently beside a woman who would sell our relationship for a down payment. He'd chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. I tried to lose myself in conversation again, finding Wendy's father, Homer, a good man and a fine carpenter. We were talking about building a wooden kayak for fishing in the fall when I happened to glance over at Wendy again. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was standing alone, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the glass of bourbon in my hand. It wasn't a casual glance. It was sharp, calculating. It was the look of a predator watching its prey. And the gut feeling of a man who's lived more than 60 years on this earth, told me something with chilling certainty. She didn't just want the money. She wanted more. And this party was far from over. We men, we spend our lives building things, a business, a home, a family. Have you ever felt like all that work was just taken for granted by the very people you did it for, like it was something they were entitled to? Share your story in the comments. I'm listening. A few minutes later, Dennis approached me again, holding out a freshly poured glass of wine. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said, his voice just loud enough for a couple of my oldest friends standing nearby to hear. "I was a little on edge before. Everything's just happening so fast." He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to be a familiar, comforting gesture, but it lingered a fraction of a second too long, a little too much pressure in his grip. It felt rehearsed. It was a performance, and not a very good one, designed to put me at ease after our tense conversation. I took the glass from him and gave a slight nod, a silent acceptance for the benefit of anyone watching. But on the inside, nothing was settled. I know my son. He was never a convincing actor, and the clumsiness of his apology only sharpened the edges of my suspicion. I needed a different perspective. "Be right back, fellas," I said to my friends. "Gotta restock the cashews." It's an old habit of mine, making sure the bowls are never empty when I have guests, but tonight it was an excuse. I needed distance. I needed to see the board from a different angle. I went inside and stood in the kitchen, the warm yellow light a stark contrast to the colorful party lights blinking in the yard. Through the small square window in the back door, I could watch the entire party, unseen. A perfect vantage point. And from there, I saw Wendy. She wasn't with Dennis anymore. She was moving, alone, toward the outdoor bar we'd set up on the patio, where fresh glasses and bottles of wine were neatly arranged. She walked with a soft, graceful gait, but there was a clear purpose in her steps. She wasn't going for a refill. She was on a mission. She scanned the crowd, her eyes lingering for a moment on the group of men I'd just been talking with, making sure I wasn't there. Then, as swift and silent as a snake striking, She reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out a packet of paper, a white paper folded into a neat quarter. Her hands, with their perfectly manicured red nails, carefully unfolded it. A stream of fine white powder cascaded into one of the pre-poured glasses of red wine. It was the glass on the far corner of the table, the one she knew would be easiest to grab and serve without anyone noticing. My heart seemed to stop for a beat, then started hammering against my ribs. This wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't about disrespect. This was something else entirely. This was a crime in motion. An icy chill shot up my spine, but a strange thing happened. As the cold spread through my veins, my mind became sharper, clearer than it had been all night. There was no panic, no flash of rage, just a deep, terrifying calm. All those years in the trenches of the business world, facing down ruthless competitors and navigating treacherous deals, they had taught me one fundamental rule. The man who loses his composure is the man who loses the game. I took a slow, deep breath. The smell of cut grass and smoked ribs was still in the air, but it felt like the world around me had thickened, the very atmosphere charged with a new, deadly gravity. In that single moment, standing in my quiet kitchen, my world had just changed forever. There are times when a man's gut feeling, that instinct honed over decades of life, is the most reliable tool he has. It's like when you're working on an engine and you just know, you can feel that one bolt isn't tight enough. Have you ever had a powerful feeling that something was deeply wrong and you turned out to be right? Let me know in the comments. Wendy picked up that exact glass. The smile returned to her face, bright and dazzling, and she walked directly toward me as I stepped back out onto the patio. "Daniel, you have to have a toast to celebrate this wonderful day," she said, her voice as sweet as honey without a single tremor. Dennis was suddenly by my side again, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. He was staring at his own feet, a statue of guilt. They were in this together. My own son was a willing accomplice in a plot I wouldn't have believed was real just 5 minutes ago. I looked at the dark red liquid in the glass she held, this substance that was supposed to be a symbol of celebration and success. Now, it looked like a death sentence. I smiled back at Wendy. It was a smile I had perfected over a lifetime of negotiations, the one I saved for the moments that mattered most. "Thank you, Wendy. That's very thoughtful of you." I reached out and took the wine glass. My hand was perfectly steady. The cool, smooth glass met my fingertips, and in that instant, as the warmth of my hand met the cold of the vessel, a plan began to spark in my mind. It wasn't just a plan to save myself. It was a plan to expose them right here, in front of every single person I respected in the world. "A toast, everyone!" Wendy's voice rang out, clear and full of a manufactured excitement that cut through the low hum of conversation. She raised her own glass, drawing the party's attention like a spotlight. "To Daniel, to a legendary career and the retirement he so richly deserves." A chorus of cheers erupted around me. The clinking of glasses was a familiar, happy sound, but tonight it wasn't music to my ears. It was the ticking of a clock, a countdown. Everyone happily joined in, their faces beaming with genuine affection, entirely oblivious to the dark undercurrent flowing beneath the celebration. Dennis raised his glass too, but his eyes weren't on me. They were darting back and forth, from his glass to the one in my hand, a nervous tick that betrayed his guilt. They were putting on a public show, creating a stage from which I couldn't possibly refuse. They needed me to drink, now, in front of everyone. They wanted a quick, clean end to their problem. The invisible pressure was immense, a physical weight on my shoulders, but it didn't crush me. It forged the steel in my spine. I needed an out. an excuse to move, to break free from the circle of eyes that was closing in on me. My mind raced, scanning the faces in the crowd for an anchor, a believable reason to shift my position. And then I saw him. "Homer!" I called out, my voice booming with a cheerfulness I didn't feel, a performance to match theirs. "Come over here. I've got something to show you. I guarantee you'll love this." I started walking toward Homer, Wendy's father, who was standing alone by the oak table where I kept a few of my favorite antiques. My hand, holding the poisoned glass, was steady as a rock. Every step was deliberate. I could feel Wendy's gaze on me, a laser beam on my back. The sudden silence from her was more telling than any shout. She was holding her breath, tense. The prey was moving off the designated spot, and she didn't like it one bit. I reached the table and carefully set my glass down, right next to a heavy antique brass compass from the Second World War. "See this, Homer?" I said, drawing his full attention to the object. "This thing crossed the Atlantic in a storm." Homer, a craftsman with a deep appreciation for things well made, leaned in, his curiosity piqued. He set his own wine glass down right next to mine to get a better look, picking up the compass with a respectful touch. Two identical glasses, filled with the same dark Cabernet, now stood inches apart on the polished wood, like two dark pools, one safe, one lethal. Under the soft patio lights, I saw the age spots on the back of my own hand as I gestured toward the compass. They were maps of a life lived, a reminder that my greatest weapon wasn't strength, but experience. While Homer turned the heavy instrument over in his hands, admiring its intricate construction and the patina of age, I kept the story going. I was selling him a story to buy myself a future. "They say its needle never pointed in the wrong direction," I said, my voice calm and even. And then, in a motion that felt both impossibly slow and blindingly fast, my hand drifted over the table. It looked like a casual gesture, just tidying up, an old man's slight fidget. My fingers brushed against the cool glass of Homer's drink. I lifted it, and in the same fluid movement, I slid my own glass into the exact spot his had just occupied. The swap took less than 2 seconds. Not a sound, not a clink, not a single drop of wine sloshed over the rim. To anyone watching, it would have looked like nothing at all. My heart was a drum against my ribs, a frantic rhythm only I could hear, but my face was just the face of an old man, lost in a memory, proudly showing off his collection. The same hand that had signed deals worth millions had just executed the most important transaction of my life. They say the older you get, the wiser you become. Do you believe that in the toughest situations, the calm and experience that come with age are more powerful weapons than brute force? Let me know what you think. "That's a hell of a piece, Daniel," Homer said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. He finally placed the compass back down with a soft, respectful click. I smiled. "It certainly is. All right, we should probably get back to the party." I picked up the glass, Homer's safe glass, and casually strolled back toward the center of the crowd. The short walk felt different now. The ground felt solid beneath my feet again. I caught Wendy's eye. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across her lips. She thought she'd won. She thought the old fish had finally taken the bait, arrogance and impatience, the fatal flaws of the young. I raised my glass high, commanding the attention of my friends and family once more. "Again, thank you all for being here," I said, my voice steady and strong. "And a special thanks to my son, Dennis, and my daughter-in-law, Wendy, for being so particularly concerned with my health tonight." I let the last few words hang in the air, my eyes locked on theirs, making sure they understood the weight of every syllable. "To a bright future," I declared. I looked directly into Wendy's eyes as I brought the glass to my lips and took a small, deliberate sip. The wine was rich and smooth, tasted like another day. I saw it then, a flicker of triumph in her pupils, a flash of pure, malevolent joy she couldn't hide. She had no idea. She thought the play was over. She didn't realize my performance had only just begun. After the toast, after the lie had been swallowed not by me but by them, the first act of my play began. I held the wine in my mouth for a second, letting the rich, earthy flavor coat my tongue. It tasted like survival. Then I swallowed. I offered a warm, slightly weary smile to the faces around me, and then slowly, deliberately, I let a subtle change begin. I started small. A few blinks, as if the party lights had suddenly become too bright, too piercing. I raised a hand to my temple, rubbing it gently, a gesture any man my age might make after a long day. It had to be believable. It had to be nothing and everything all at once. Then I allowed a slight sway, a barely perceptible lurch to the side, just enough for the person nearest to me to notice. My hand found the back of a nearby patio chair, gripping it for balance. In my mind, I was a director watching an actor, critiquing every move. The performance had to be flawless. I've watched enough old John Wayne movies to know what a man looks like when he's trying to hide that he's been hit. Wendy was on me in a flash, a whirlwind of feigned concern. "Dad! Dad, are you okay?" Her voice was pitched just right, a perfect blend of alarm and affection for anyone listening. But I saw it. For less than a heartbeat, before the mask of the loving daughter-in-law slammed back down, her eyes lit up. It wasn't just joy. It was the pure, unadulterated gleam of a predator that sees its prey finally stumble into the snare. In that single, unguarded moment, I saw the truth of her, stripped bare. Dennis, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, terrified shell of my son. The confidence he'd shown earlier had evaporated. "Dad, Dad, what's wrong?" he stammered, his eyes wide with genuine panic. He may have been her accomplice, a willing participant in the betrayal, but he wasn't a monster. Not yet, anyway. He lacked the cold, hard steel that made up his wife's spine. Seeing me falter, seeing the real-world consequence of their plan was tearing him apart. The guilt was eating him alive. I'm all right," I managed, my voice a carefully crafted rasp. "Just the heat, I think, and maybe a little too much of this good wine." I let out a weak chuckle. "I just need to sit down for a minute, inside." This was the invitation. This was the moment I turned their trap back on them. I had to lure them away from the crowd, away from the prying eyes of my friends, and into a space where they felt they had complete control. A place where their masks would come off. "Dennis, Wendy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Could you help your old man to the den?" I let my eyes close for a second too long. A perfect imitation of a man fighting a wave of dizziness. They took my arms, one on each side. Wendy's grip was firm, her fingers digging into my bicep. It wasn't the supportive touch of a caregiver. It was the grip of a jailer. I could feel her impatience, her eagerness to get me isolated. Dennis's hand, however, was trembling and slick with sweat. He barely held on, his touch hesitant, as if he were afraid of what he had done, afraid that the poison could somehow travel through my skin into his. As they walked me through the party, I could hear the whispers of concern ripple through the crowd. And over it all, I heard Wendy's smooth, reassuring voice. "It's okay, everyone. He just overdid it a little. We'll take care of him." She was playing the part of the doting daughter-in-law to perfection. When we reached the quiet of the den, I let my body go limp, allowing my full weight to fall on them for a moment before collapsing into my old, familiar lazy boy recliner. I let out a long, ragged breath and let my head fall back against the worn leather. My eyes closed, but they weren't fully closed. Through the thinnest of slits, I watched. The room was my sanctuary, bathed in the soft, warm glow of a single lamp, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside me. I saw Wendy give Dennis a sharp, commanding look, jerking her head toward the door. She wanted him gone. She wanted to be alone with me. The fox was finally in the hen house. "Honey, go get Dad a glass of water," she said to Dennis, her voice low and authoritative. "I'll stay here with him." Dennis hesitated, his eyes flicking from me to her, a storm of conflict raging within him. But he was weak. He always had been when it came to her. He gave a short, jerky nod and walked out, pulling the heavy oak door closed behind him. The latch clicked shut, a soft, final sound that echoed in the silence of the room. It was the sound of the trap being sprung. It was just the two of us now. I could hear her breathing, a little too fast, a little too shallow, the sound of pure, unadulterated excitement. She thought she had me. She thought her plan was complete. She had no idea she was the one who had just been locked inside. She knelt beside my chair, her shadow falling over me. In her mind, I was already gone, a lifeless piece of furniture in a room she was about to own. The air grew thick with her triumph. And then she spoke, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for the dead. "You foolish old man," she breathed, the sweetness gone, replaced by a curdled contempt that turned my blood to ice. "Did you really think you were so clever? A lifetime building an empire, and it all comes down to a little white powder. That money should have been ours. Dennis is too weak, too sentimental, but I'm not. I take what I'm owed." Every word was a confirmation, a final, brutal validation of the monster I had seen hiding behind her smile. It wasn't the insult that stung. I've been called worse by better men. It was the chilling finality of it, the realization that this wasn't just greed. This was a complete absence of a soul. She wasn't just taking something from me. She believed it was her right, that my life's work, my very existence, was simply an obstacle to be removed. I lay there, motionless, letting her words hang in the air, letting them become a part of the evidence. And in that moment of her absolute victory, the universe decided to intervene. The heavy oak door swung open. Dennis stood there, a glass of water trembling in his hand. Behind him, silhouetted in the doorway, were Homer and two of my oldest friends, Mark and Sam. Their faces were etched with concern. Dennis froze, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, the terror of being caught. But Wendy, lost in her monologue, didn't even turn. She was too absorbed in her victory to notice the audience that had just arrived. "Did you bring the papers?" she hissed at Dennis, her back still to the door. That was my cue. Slowly, deliberately, I opened my eyes. I didn't gasp. I didn't sit up. I simply let my eyes meet hers. There was no anger in my gaze, no fear, just a calm, quiet clarity. A silence more profound and more damning than any accusation I could ever level. The effect was instantaneous. The triumphant smirk on Wendy's face didn't just fade, it shattered. It froze in place, a grotesque mask of victory before crumbling into 1,000 pieces. The blood drained from her face, leaving a pale, waxy canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as if her entire being had short-circuited. "Dad, she finally stammered, the words catching in her throat. I pushed myself up in the chair, not with the weakness of a drugged man, but with the steady strength of a man in complete control. Every movement was deliberate, measured. I'm perfectly fine, Wendy, I said, my voice even and clear, cutting through the silence of the room like a surgeon's scalpel. But you're about to have a very serious problem. I raised my arm and pointed, not at her, but at the small oak table by the door where Homer now stood, looking utterly bewildered. The wineglass, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. The one I switched. It's still on the table, right next to that old brass compass, the glass you put the powder in. Every head in the room snapped toward the table. There it sat, a silent accuser, the deep red liquid shimmering under the lamplight. Homer stared at it, then at his daughter, his face a mask of confusion and dawning dread. He was a simple man, a good man who worked with his hands. This kind of treachery was from a world he didn't understand. "Wendy, what is he talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking. Wendy couldn't answer. She just shook her head frantically, fat tears beginning to well in her eyes. But these weren't the tears of remorse. They were the tears of a cornered animal, the tears of fear and desperation. My son, Dennis, stood like a statue carved from shame, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. "We can have the contents of that glass tested, of course," I continued, my voice calm, methodical. "We can see just how much you cared about your father-in-law's health tonight." The word tested was the trigger. It was the one word that broke through her paralysis. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat. She launched herself toward the table, a blur of rage and panic. With a wild sweep of her arm, she sent the wineglass flying. It hit the hardwood floor and exploded into 100 glittering shards. Red wine sprayed across the polished wood and splattered against the wall, a violent stain of red on white like blood and tears. It was a desperate, futile attempt to destroy the evidence, an act that did nothing but scream her guilt to the heavens. Homer stared at the wreckage, then at his daughter, his face collapsing under the weight of a pain I wouldn't wish on any father. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief and heartbreak. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. "Daniel, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I gave him a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement from one father to another. My gaze then fell upon my son, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't looked up. "As for you, son," I said, the words heavy with a future yet to be decided, "you and I will have a very long talk when this is all over." My party was in ruins. The sounds of celebration outside seemed a world away. But in the wreckage of that room, surrounded by broken glass and broken trust, I felt a strange sense of victory. I had lost a son, perhaps for good, but I had taken back something far more valuable. I had taken back my honor. I had taken back the truth, and my story, the real one, was just beginning. After the sound of the shattering glass faded, a silence fell over the room. It was a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the tense silence of a standoff. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an ending. A final, irrevocable conclusion. No one else needed to speak. My friends, the men who had stood by me through boardroom battles and market crashes, they understood. One by one, they came over. There were no questions, no demands for explanation. They had seen enough. Mark put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed, a gesture that said more than 1,000 words. Sam just gave me a slow, sad nod. They filed out of the room, and soon I could hear their cars starting, their headlights sweeping across the lawn before they disappeared down the driveway. The music outside had long since died. The cheerful chatter was replaced by the chirping of crickets, a sound that usually brought me peace but now only seemed to amplify the emptiness. My house, which only an hour ago had been overflowing with life and laughter, felt cavernous. The victory I had engineered felt hollow, leaving behind only the bitter ash of what had been destroyed. There was no elation, only a profound ache for the broken pieces that could never be put back together. Homer didn't leave with the others. He stood there for a long moment, a statue of grief, before he turned without a word and walked to the small utility closet off the kitchen. He returned with a broom and a dustpan. His wife, Myra, stood by the doorway, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I just sat there, in my armchair, and watched him. He swept up the glass with a slow, meticulous care. The soft scrape of the bristles on the hardwood floor, the gentle clink of the shards as he nudged them into the pan, every sound was an apology. He wasn't just cleaning a mess, he was performing a ritual. He was a good man, a craftsman, trying to sweep up the shattered honor of his own family. He was trying to fix something that was irreparably broken, and in his quiet, dignified labor, I saw a reflection of my own life's work, a constant effort to build and maintain, only to see it all come crashing down. When he was finished, he carefully emptied the dustpan into the trash. He walked back to me, his face etched with a pain that mirrored my own. He gave me one last nod, a silent acknowledgement from one father to another, and then he and Myra were gone. The front door clicked shut behind them, and the sound echoed in the sudden, absolute stillness. I was alone with my children, or what was left of them. Wendy had collapsed onto the floor amidst the mess, her sobs raw and ugly, but listening closely, I could hear the notes of fury and frustration in her cries. There was no remorse, only the rage of a plan that had failed. Dennis stood over her, paralyzed by indecision. He was caught in the crossfire, torn between the woman he had married and the father he had just betrayed. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate for me to say something, to do something, to rewind the clock and make it all go away. But I knew better. Some cracks can't be sealed, some breaks are final. Finally, he took a deep breath, the breath of a man making a choice. He bent down and gently helped Wendy to her feet. "Let's go home," he whispered. He had chosen. And once again, he had not chosen me. They walked out without another word, without a backward glance. And as I watched my son's back disappear through the door for the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of relief at his departure. The charade was over. I sat alone in the quiet room. The air was thick with the ghost of the party, the scent of spilled wine, a faint tang of dust from the shattered glass. My lazy boy, my throne for countless Sunday football games, felt cold and unfamiliar. There was no anger left in me, no satisfaction, just a weariness that went clear to the bone. I had won a war I never wanted to fight, and the price had been a part of my own heart. I stared out the window into the deep, impenetrable black of the night. It was going to be the longest night of my life, a night to finally face the truth. The family I thought I had, the one I'd spent a lifetime providing for, hadn't really existed for a very long time. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't facing an enemy, but accepting the truth about the people you love. After a big blow-up, a lot of us men retreat to our quiet places, the garage, the wood shop, just to get our thoughts straight. What's your space for thinking when life gets too loud? Let me know in the comments. My gaze drifted to the table and landed on the old brass compass, the inanimate object that had somehow become my silent accomplice. I picked it up, its weight cool and solid in my palm. It had navigated through storms, witnessed battles I could only imagine, yet its needle always pointed true north. It was a reminder that no matter how turbulent the seas of life become, You won't get lost if you hold on to your own true north, your own core values. I walked over to the fireplace and placed the compass on the mantel, giving it a place of honor. It was more than an antique now. It was a monument to the stand I had taken tonight. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, watching the night bleed away, watching the first faint whispers of dawn creep through the windows. The morning light didn't bring its usual warmth. It just served as a harsh spotlight on the wreckage of my home. Half-drunk glasses on every surface, plates of picked-over food, discarded napkins, the artifacts of a celebration that had died. I knew, sitting there, that everything was different now. There would be no more strained family dinners, no more saccharine lies to sweeten the bitter truth. From now on, there would only be what was real. And as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. This wasn't an ending. It was the first page of a new chapter, one I would write on my own terms. 2 days after the party, my phone rang. The screen lit up with Dennis's name. A part of me wanted to just let it ring, to swipe it into oblivion. But another part, the part that will always be a father, needed to know what he would say. I answered the call but said nothing. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. A long, drawn-out quiet filled with the sound of his breathing, heavy, hesitant, and full of unspoken words. I could picture him standing somewhere, phone pressed to his ear, wrestling with 1,000 excuses, 1,000 apologies, none of which could find their way out. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. And in that moment, his silence was worse than all of Wendy's venomous lies. It was the sound of cowardice, the sound of a man who couldn't face the consequences of his own choices. After what felt like an eternity of this shared empty space, I ended the call. I hung up on my own son. The house felt too quiet, too full of ghosts. I needed to get away, so I went down to my sanctuary, my woodshop in the basement. The moment I opened the door, the familiar scent of pine, oak, and machine oil filled my lungs, and for a second I felt a sense of peace. This was my place, a place of creation, of order, of things that made sense. I ran my hand over the scarred surface of my old workbench, its wood darkened with decades of sweat and sawdust, and the memories, they just came flooding back. I remembered weekends spent down here with a young Dennis, his small hands trying to grip a handsaw that was almost as big as he was. I remembered teaching him how to measure twice and cut once, the look of intense concentration on his face as he tried to hammer his first nail straight. I'd had this hope, this dream, that he'd follow in my footsteps, not necessarily in business, but in spirit. That he'd find the same quiet pride I did in building something real and tangible with his own 2 hands. The pinnacle of it all was the go-kart. I built it for him from scratch for his 10th birthday. We spent weeks on it, sketching out plans, cutting the wood, mounting the engine from an old lawnmower. The day we finished it, the smile that lit up his face as he took that first ride down the street, that was the greatest payment I ever received. I had given him everything, not just money, not just things. I gave him my time, my knowledge, my full attention, the very best of myself. And standing there, in the silence of my workshop, I had to face the fact that somehow it hadn't been enough. He showed up at my door that afternoon. He didn't ring the bell, just stood on the porch until I saw him through the window. When I opened the door, he wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on his worn-out New Balance sneakers, as if they held the answers to the universe. "Dad, he started. Then his voice trailed off into nothing. He took a shaky breath. "Wendy. She didn't mean it. She's been under a lot of financial pressure." I didn't respond. I just looked at him, at the son I had raised. Financial pressure? I bought them their first house as a wedding gift. I paid for his master's degree without him ever having to take out a loan. I never said no. Never. His excuse wasn't just flimsy, it was an insult to every sacrifice I'd ever made for him. "Did you know what was in that glass, Dennis?" I finally asked. My voice wasn't angry, it was just tired, so incredibly tired. He flinched, then shook his head frantically. "No, I swear I didn't. I thought it was a mild sedative or something, to make you more agreeable." There it was, the confession. He knew she was putting something in my drink, and he stood by and did nothing. He was an accomplice. "You stood there and watched," I said, the words falling like stones between us. "You let it happen." I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth had enough weight on its own to crush any defense he could possibly mount. He just stood there, a grown man in his 30s, looking smaller and more pitiful than he did the day he scraped his knee falling off his first bike. That was the end of our conversation. There was no hug, no promise to make things right. He just turned and walked away, leaving an even bigger void than before. It finally hit me that the root of the problem wasn't just Wendy. It was my son. My son had allowed another person's greed to poison the bond between a father and son. He had chosen the easy path instead of the right one. Later that evening, I found myself pulling out the old photo albums, heavy, leather-bound books filled with a life I thought I knew. I turned the thick pages, looking at the glossy images of a happy family. There we were, Dennis on my shoulders at a 4th of July parade, the three of us on a fishing trip, holding up a string of trout, grinning from ear to ear, a birthday party, Dennis blowing out the candles on a cake my late wife had baked. But looking at them now, the warmth was gone. All I felt was a hollow ache, a profound sadness for a past that now felt like a well-acted play, a story I had told myself for so long that I had started to believe it was true. Staring at those faded photographs, a quiet resolve settled over me. I couldn't live in this fiction anymore. I couldn't be the endless provider, the emotional bedrock, without receiving the bare minimum of respect in return. The next morning, I called my lawyer. It wasn't about revenge. It was about self-preservation. It was about protecting the legacy I had spent a lifetime building. It was time to set boundaries. It was time to teach my son one final, painful lesson. That love isn't a blank check. It requires respect. It demands accountability. The morning I walked into my lawyer's office, the air inside felt different from the world outside. It smelled of old paper, leather-bound books, and freshly brewed coffee. A scent of order, of logic. It was grounding. My lawyer, Jim, is a man I've known for 30 years. He helped me draft the first contracts for my company, and he was there when I signed the papers to sell it. He's seen me at my best and my worst. I didn't go in there to cry on his shoulder. I walked in like I was walking into a boardroom meeting to discuss a hostile takeover. I laid out the facts, point by point, from the demand for $5 million to the white powder to the shattered wine glass on my floor. I was concise, clinical. I kept the emotion out of my voice because the facts themselves were heavy enough. Jim listened, his pen scratching occasionally in a worn leather notebook. He didn't offer pity, and I was grateful for that. A man my age doesn't need pity. He needs a plan. When I finished, he looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "All right, Daniel," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Here's what we do." He talked about revocable trusts, powers of attorney, and updating my will. The conversation was all about action, about building fortifications. I walked out of his office an hour later, not feeling happy, but feeling something that had been missing for days: purpose. The storm was still raging, but now I had a map. The first thing I did when I got home was call a locksmith. A young man showed up in a van, all business and efficiency. He got to work immediately, and the quiet of my house was filled with the sharp, clean sounds of drilling, of metal striking metal. It was a strange kind of music. With each old lock that was removed, it felt like a connection to the past was being surgically severed. It was loud, decisive, and final. When he was done, he handed me a new set of keys, and their weight in my palm felt substantial. This wasn't just metal. This was security. This was a physical declaration that this space was mine and no one could enter it again without my permission. That night, when I slid the new key into the lock and turned it, the deadbolt shot home with a solid, satisfying thud. Click. It was the sound of a wall going up, a door being closed, and for the first time since the party, I felt like I could finally breathe again. With a new sense of resolve, I sat down at my desk in the study. For the next several hours, I went through years of financial records, focusing on the joint account I'd set up for Dennis, meant for emergencies. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun, just clarity. And I found it, not in one large glaring withdrawal, but in 1,000 tiny cuts, page after page of small, insignificant transactions that, when added up, told a story of entitlement, gas for their cars, expensive dinners I was never invited to, weekend getaways they claimed they'd paid for themselves. It was a slow, steady bleed, a quiet siphoning that had gone on for years. The anger I expected to feel never came. It was replaced by something colder, heavier, a deep, bone-chilling disappointment. This wasn't a one-time act of desperation driven by pressure. This was a pattern, a mindset that viewed my life's work not as a gift, but as a resource to be tapped at will. A few weeks later, the war shifted to a new front. I got a call from my cousin down in Texas. She sounded worried, hesitant. She told me she'd spoken to Wendy, who had spun a whole new story. In Wendy's version, I was the one who was unwell. She'd told my cousin I was having memory problems, that I'd become paranoid, that I was tragically pushing my only son away in my confusion. It was a brilliant, insidious move. She wasn't attacking my actions. She was attacking my credibility. She was trying to strip me of the one weapon an older man has left, his reputation for being of sound mind. She was painting a picture of a sad, senile old man who couldn't be trusted, whose reality was fractured. I listened patiently, the receiver cold against my ear. When my cousin was finished, I just thanked her for her honesty and for letting me know. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I now understood the game she was playing. You know, a man builds loyalty to brands over a lifetime. Whether it's your DeWalt power tools or your Ford truck, you stick with what's proven to be tough and reliable. You trust what's real. Let me know in the comments, what's a brand you've stuck by through the years, one you know you can always count on? I wasn't going to get into a shouting match. I wasn't going to play Wendy's dirty game. I was going to do what I've always done in business, rely on the facts. I sat down at my desk and wrote a letter. It wasn't emotional. It didn't contain a single accusation or angry word. It was just a timeline of events laid out in plain, simple English. It started with the demand for money and ended with the act of smashing the wine glass to destroy the evidence. I made a few copies and sent them to a small handful of key family members, the ones I knew were level-headed, the ones whose judgment I trusted. I didn't ask them to take my side. I didn't ask them for anything. I just gave them the truth. A few days later, a call came from an unfamiliar Texas number. It was my cousin's husband, a former Marine, a man of few words but solid character. "Daniel," he said, his voice direct, "I read your letter. I just wanted to call and say I believe you. And if you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you call me." That was it. A few simple sentences. But in that moment, They felt like a lifeline. Just when I thought I was standing completely alone, a hand reached out from a place I never expected. It was a small thing, maybe, but it gave me the strength to keep walking the path I had chosen, the path of truth and of honor. In a small town, news travels faster than a wildfire on a dry day. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It moves through the Rotary Club meetings, over coffee at the local diner, and in the quiet moments after the Sunday service. I didn't have to tell anyone what happened. The story took on a life of its own, carried by the men who had stood in my living room and witnessed the truth with their own eyes. The first ripple I heard about was Homer and Myra. A friend from the club mentioned it to me, his voice low. He said they hadn't been to church in weeks. They weren't showing up at the diner for their regular Saturday breakfast anymore. They were isolating themselves. And it wasn't because people were shunning them. It was because they were carrying a shame that wasn't theirs to bear. The thought of it sat heavy in my chest. Their pain, in some ways, felt deeper than my own. I had lost a son who had made his choice, but they had lost a daughter to a darkness they never knew existed. They were good, hard-working people, caught in the fallout of their child's greed, and that felt like a particular kind of injustice. Reputation, in the world I come from, is the only currency that truly matters. It's built over a lifetime of handshakes, of kept promises, of showing up when you're needed. It can't be bought. And once it's broken, it's nearly impossible to fix. One of my oldest friends, a man who was there at the party, happened to be a partner in a major construction project with Dennis's firm. About a week after I'd sent out my letter, he called me. His tone was all business. "Daniel," he said, "I just wanted you to hear it from me first. I have terminated my contract with Dennis's company." I started to say he didn't have to do that, but he cut me off. "It's not about you or me," he explained. "It's about principle. I can't do business with a man I don't respect. A man who stands by and watches that kind of thing happen, his foundation is cracked." I didn't ask him to do it. I didn't have to. For men of our generation, your word is your bond, and your character is your handshake. Dennis was learning, in the most brutal way, that the world I had built was held together by an honor code he had violated. With the walls of the real world closing in, Wendy turned to the only place she had left, the internet. She started posting on Facebook. Vague, self-pitying statuses about family struggles and the pain of being misunderstood. She'd post old family photos of her and Dennis smiling on vacation, of Christmases past, with captions dripping in passive-aggressive sentiment about love and sacrifice. It was a masterclass in playing the victim. She was trying to build a new narrative for an audience that hadn't been there, casting herself as the devoted daughter-in-law, suffering at the hands of a difficult aging patriarch. It was a cheap, flimsy performance, but I knew that in the world of curated images and carefully crafted captions, it could be dangerously effective. But she underestimated our town. She underestimated the weight of lived experience over digital whispers. My friends, the men who were there, they didn't engage. They didn't comment or argue. Their silence was the most powerful judgment of all. When Wendy's name came up in conversation, there would be a subtle shake of the head, a quick change of subject. The story of my party didn't spread like gossip. It settled like a cautionary tale. Before long, Dennis and Wendy felt the chill. The invitations to barbecues stopped coming. The friendly calls dried up. They had their money, but they had traded their community for it. They were living on an island of their own making. Meanwhile, I decided it was time to rejoin the living. I called up my golf buddies and told them I'd be there for our regular Tuesday game. I'd missed a few weeks, and when I showed up at the course, the air was a little thick with unspoken words. Nobody knew what to say. We just nodded, loaded our bags onto the carts, and started playing. For the first 2 holes, we talked about the weather, about the new driver someone bought. Then, on the 3rd hole, I hit a terrible shot, shanking the ball right into the woods. As I stood there, staring in disgust after my ball, one of my friends, Bill, walked over, put a hand on my shoulder, and said with a deadpan expression, "Daniel, that shot was almost as ugly as your daughter-in-law's acting." The other guys heard him. For a second there was silence. Then a chuckle. Then all 4 of us burst out laughing. It was a deep, gut-wrenching, cleansing laughter that broke all the tension. And in that moment, I knew. This was my family. These men, with their terrible jokes and their unspoken understanding, they didn't need me to explain a thing. They just needed me to be there. Driving home later in my old Ford F-150, I rolled the windows down and let the evening air whip through the cab. I turned on the radio, and an old Creedence Clearwater Revival song came on. One of those tracks that's been the background music to my life since I was a young man. The familiar guitar riff, the gravelly voice singing about being born on the bayou. A strange sense of peace washed over me. The weight that had been sitting on my shoulders for weeks seemed to lift, carried away on the wind. I had lost a son, yes. The boy I'd raised, the family I thought I had, was gone. But as the truck rumbled down that familiar country road, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had finally gotten myself back. A Daniel who wasn't a father or a CEO or a provider, just Daniel. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. A few months went by. The leaves on the old oak tree outside my window had turned from a tired green to a brilliant gold. I found myself back in Jim's office, the air thick with that familiar smell of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. It was the smell of order, of things being put right. Spread out on the polished mahogany table in front of me were the final documents, the last chapter of a long, complicated story. I looked at the papers, the neat black ink on crisp white sheets. The trust was established. The will was rewritten. It felt different from any business deal I'd ever closed. There was no thrill of victory, no adrenaline of the negotiation, just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. I didn't cut Dennis out completely. I left him a small, carefully structured portion, just enough that he couldn't contest the will on the grounds of my senility. But the bulk of it, the real heart of my life's work, was now headed in a new direction. I had established a scholarship fund in my late wife's name. It wasn't for some fancy university. It was for the local vocational college, for the kids who wanted to learn a trade, to build things with their hands. My legacy wasn't going to be about entitlement anymore. It was going to be about empowerment. I wanted to build bridges for those who were willing to walk across them, not walls to protect a son who refused to stand on his own. With a steady hand, I picked up the pen and signed my name, each stroke feeling less like an ending and more like a true beginning. As I'd expected, the call came a few days later. It was Dennis. His voice on the other end of the line was thin, frayed, stripped of all its former confidence. "Dad, I lost the contract," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Wendy, she's leaving me. She says it's all my fault." Then came the sound I'd been dreading, but knew was inevitable. The broken, heaving sobs of a grown man who had hit rock bottom. And after the tears came the familiar refrain. "I need money, Dad, just this once, just enough to get back on my feet." I listened. I let him say everything he needed to say, purging all the desperation and self-pity. When he was finally done, the line went quiet, filled only by the sound of his ragged breathing. We men spend our whole lives teaching our kids how to throw a ball, how to change a tire, how to be a man. But maybe the most important lesson, the hardest one, is teaching them how to stand up on their own 2 feet after they've been knocked down. Sometimes the best help you can give is to step back and let them learn how to handle the consequences themselves, don't you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. After a long pause, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady. "Dennis," I said, "forgiveness is a long road, and it has to start with you taking responsibility for your own life. You're a grown man. It's time you learn to stand up by yourself. I can't be the safety net anymore." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then I added, "I wish you luck, son." And I hung up the phone. My hand didn't tremble. My heart ached, a deep primal pain of a father performing a necessary amputation to save the rest of himself. But in that pain, there was also clarity. It was the only right thing left to do. The big family house went on the market a week later. It was filled with too many ghosts, too many memories of a life that was no longer mine. I needed a clean slate. I found a smaller place, a cabin by the lake with a magnificent workshop and a wide back porch that looked out over the water. It was a house built for one, a place for quiet work and contemplation. I didn't need empty rooms and long hallways anymore. I just needed a place where I could hear the birds in the morning and feel the peace of the water. One afternoon, I was in the new workshop, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the air. I was planning the first long strips of wood for the kayak, the one Homer and I had talked about what felt like a lifetime ago. The door creaked open and he walked in. He didn't say a word about Wendy or Dennis. He just looked at the design plans I had tacked to the wall, then at the smooth strips of cedar I was working on. "Cedar, huh? Good choice," was all he said. Then he picked up a piece of sandpaper and a spare plank, and he started sanding, his hands moving with the familiar steady rhythm of a master craftsman. We worked like that for hours, side by side in a comfortable silence. The only sounds were the scrape of the plane and the whisper of the sandpaper. It was the quiet language of men who understood that some wounds are too deep for words, and that healing sometimes comes not from talking, but from building something together. A few months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I carried the finished kayak down to the water's edge. It slid into the lake with a gentle splash. I paddled out to the middle, the water as still as glass, reflecting the brilliant blue sky and the fiery reds and golds of the shoreline trees. I stopped paddling and just drifted, taking a deep breath, the clean, cool air filling my lungs. And I realized then what a man's legacy truly is. It isn't the money he leaves behind or the assets he passes on to his children. A true legacy is in the values he lives by. It's in the lessons he teaches, no matter how hard they are. And the greatest legacy I could leave for myself was this very moment. This freedom. The freedom to live out the rest of my days with honesty, with peace, and with my dignity intact. And out there, in the quiet middle of the lake, I smiled. Sharing this story with you is a big part of that new freedom. I know that when we men, those of us who are more than halfway through this journey of life, get together, the stories just start to flow. Today, I wanted to open up a little, and I'd be honored to hear your stories too. You know, sometimes it's just a simple click, a like, a subscribe, show, or a share. To many, it might seem like a small, fleeting gesture, but to me and to all the quiet voices out there that need to be heard, every single one of those clicks is a light in the dark. It says, "I see you, I hear you. Your story matters." Now that I've told my story, what I want most is to hear from you. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt disrespected or unheard? Do you have a passion that others dismissed as foolish? Or what was a moment when you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please, share. I'll read them and carry them with me, because your stories are important. WAWA Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have a hardship to share today, then share a small joy. What made you smile today? And if you're watching this on your TV, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and find my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this into a community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me today. It means more than you know.